In the summer of 1665, a man in a dark leather coat walked into the city of London with a cane in one hand and a book of remedies in the other, knowing that half the official people he would see were already dead. They just hadn't stopped moving yet. His name was lost to history, swallowed by time and the sheer volume of death that surrounded him. But his image, the long beaked mask stuffed with herbs and rose petals, the thick waxed coat designed to repel the invisible corruption of the air, the cane held before him like a staff of office or a weapon against the unseen, became immortal. He was a plague doctor, and he walked into a city transformed into a charnel house by forces he did not understand and could not stop. The plague doctor has become a symbol of everything wrong with medieval and Renaissance medicine: superstition, ignorance, futility, fear, expressed in Baroque costume. When we see that beaked mask now in museums or in artistic renderings, we see it as evidence of how completely wrong people can be about how disease works, how stubbornly they can cling to theories that have no basis in reality. We use the plague doctor as a shorthand for medical failure, for the persistence of false belief in the face of mounting evidence. The costume looks so absurd to our modern eyes that it seems impossible anyone ever believed it would work. And yet they did. For more than 400 years, educated physicians put on those costumes and walked into plague-stricken cities, convinced that what they were doing might help, even as at some level of consciousness they perhaps never fully acknowledged. They suspected it would not. The story of the plague doctor is not simply a story of foolishness or superstition, though foolishness and superstition certainly played a role. It is a story about the limits of human knowledge, about what people do when faced with catastrophe, about the gap between what we think we know and what is actually true. It is a story about educated men doing serious intellectual work within frameworks that were almost entirely wrong, yet arriving at some conclusions that were surprisingly prescient. It is a story about sacrifice, because many plague doctors died in their service, walking into situations where they knew, at some level, that death was probable. It is a story about the foundation of modern medicine and public health, because practices developed by plague doctors, even though they were based on false theories, accidentally worked well enough that they became embedded in our approach to disease. Most of all, it is a story about human beings choosing to act, to try, to do something in the face of forces that seem to defy all understanding and all resistance. The path that the plague doctors walked is a path that can be traced across centuries and continents, from the first terrible outbreaks of the Black Death in the 14th century through the periodic recurrences that devastated cities repeatedly for the next 500 years into the early modern period, when the disease became less apocalyptic but no less persistent, and finally into the 19th century, when the emergence of germ theory and modern microscopy began to reveal the actual nature of plague and render the old methods obsolete. This is the Reaper's Road, the path carved through history by those who chose to follow death and try to stop it, even with inadequate tools and false theories. Before we continue with the full chronicle of this history, before we walk down that road and see what we find there is something important to understand about the world that produced the plague doctor. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The world of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where the plague doctor emerged as a professional figure, was a world where the nature of disease was genuinely mysterious. The germ theory of disease, which seems almost obviously true to us now, would not be firmly established until the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the latter part of the 19th century. The microscope, which could have revealed the existence of bacteria and viruses, did not exist until the early 17th century, and even then it was crude, limited in magnification, unreliable in its results. The scientific method as we would come to understand it, was still being developed. Francis Bacon had published his ideas about empirical observation only in the early 1600s. Isaac Newton would not publish his Principia Mathematica until 1687. The world was still operating largely on principles inherited from ancient authorities, Hippocrates, Galen, Aristotle, whose observations had been keen, but whose understanding of the underlying mechanisms of nature was fundamentally limited by the tools available to them. In this context, the theory of humors was not a product of ignorance or superstition, but of serious, systematic thinking about the body and disease. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were understood to correspond to the four elements: air, water, fire, and earth. They were understood to have qualities. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Health, according to this system, depended on the proper balance of these humors. Disease arose from imbalance, too much of one humor, not enough of another. Treatments, therefore, logically consisted of restoring balance. If you had too much blood, you bled the patient. If you had excessive phlegm, you administered laxatives. If you had an imbalance that required heating, you applied heat or gave heating medicines. If you needed cooling, you applied cold. This system had the virtue of internal logical consistency. Within its own framework, it made sense. Moreover, it was supported by observable phenomena. Bloodletting sometimes seemed to help patients. Laxatives sometimes seemed to relieve symptoms. Heat sometimes improved conditions. Cold sometimes improved other conditions. The system was also supported by the weight of classical authority. These were the theories of the ancients, of the great physicians of Greece and Rome, whose accomplishments were undeniable. To question the theory would have been to question not just medical practice, but the very foundations of knowledge and authority that held society together. But there was another theory that would become increasingly important in understanding disease, particularly plague, the theory of miasma. Miasma literally means pollution or bad air. The idea was that disease arose from foul air, corrupted by the decay of organic matter, by putrefaction, by the exhalations of the sick and the dead. This theory was also ancient in origin, also connected to classical authorities, and also had the virtue of explaining observable phenomena. Bad smells did seem to correlate with disease. Graveyards had disease, sewers had disease, slaughterhouses had disease. The great plagues seemed to arise in cities where there was decay, where there was overcrowding, where there was poor sanitation. If you got rid of the bad smells, if you avoided places with foul air, if you kept yourself in fresh air, you seemed to be less likely to get sick. Therefore, if disease was caused by bad air, it followed that good air would help you avoid disease or recover from it. These two theories, humoral theory and miasma theory, were not in competition with each other, but rather were understood to work together. Miasma was thought to work by corrupting the humors. Bad air would imbalance the humors, and therefore disease would arise. Treatment could work on both levels. You could try to remove the patient from the bad air, and you could also try to rebalance the humors through the various means available: bloodletting, laxatives, medicines, the application of heat or cold. A physician operating in the 16th or 17th century would understand himself as working within a coherent, sophisticated system of thought about the nature of disease and the methods to treat it. The problem, of course, was that this entire system was wrong. Plague is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This bacterium is transmitted to humans primarily through the bites of fleas that have fed on infected rats. In some cases, particularly in pneumonic plague, the disease can be transmitted from human to human through respiratory droplets. Bloodletting doesn't help. It weakens the patient and makes them more vulnerable. Laxatives don't help. They further deplete the patient. The four humors don't exist as described. The properties attributed to them don't match biological reality. Miasma doesn't cause disease. Invisible organisms do. None of the treatments that physicians prescribed on the basis of these theories actually worked against plague. A patient with untreated plague has roughly a 60% mortality rate. A patient with treated plague, where treatment consists of bloodletting and herbal remedies based on humoral theory, has roughly the same mortality rate, sometimes even slightly higher. The treatments accomplished nothing except to weaken the patient further and perhaps hasten death. And yet, the physicians who prescribed these treatments were not fools, and they were not willfully ignorant. They were educated men, products of universities, trained in the classical medical texts, practicing within the best framework available to them. That the framework was almost completely wrong was not something they could have known. They only knew that certain treatments seemed to help some patients, or at least that patients who received treatment sometimes recovered. They knew that they were physicians, educated and trained, and that the society placed tremendous responsibility on them to do something about the plague that was killing their neighbors and their families and themselves. The plague itself emerged from history's distant past, from the deep parts of the old world where ecosystems had evolved in isolation. Yersinia pestis likely originated in Central Asia, where it maintained itself in populations of rodents, particularly marmots and rats, in a delicate and terrible equilibrium. The disease would cycle through these populations, a period of high infection, where many animals died, then a period of low infection as the susceptible animals were killed off and the surviving animals had immunity. Then eventually a new outbreak as animals with no immunity were born and the bacteria could spread again. For centuries, perhaps for millennia, the plague existed in these regions, occasionally killing animals and occasionally humans in those areas, but isolated from the rest of the world by geography and distance. Then the world began to shrink. Trade routes expanded. The Mongol Empire, despite all its violence and chaos, had created a period of relative security on the trade routes that connected east and west. Caravans moved along the Silk Road. Merchants traveled from China to the Mediterranean. With the goods and the merchants came something else: the plague. It is likely that the plague reached Europe earlier than we have direct historical evidence for it. But the first well-documented arrival is in 1347, when Genoese traders arrived in Messina, Sicily, with ships carrying plague-infected crew and cargo. Some accounts, possibly legendary but reflecting a real situation, describe Mongol armies catapulting infected bodies into the harbor to spread the disease as a weapon of war. Whether or not that specific detail is true, the effect was the same. The plague was in Europe now, and it would begin a process of infection that would reshape the continent. The speed of the plague spread was terrifying and would remain one of its most striking features. From Messina, it moved to other Mediterranean ports within weeks. From ports, it moved inland along trade routes and roads. A merchant caravan could carry the disease hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. A ship could carry it across the Mediterranean in days. Within a year of arriving in Sicily, plague was present in major cities throughout southern Europe. Within 3 years, it had reached France and England. Within 5 years, it was in Germany and Eastern Europe. The first wave of the Black Death would ultimately affect the entire known world, spreading to Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia, though the European outbreak is the most thoroughly documented. The mortality was unlike anything Europe had experienced. The plague moved through cities like a fire through dry wood. In some places, mortality reached 50 to 70%. An entire city could be devastated in a matter of weeks. Families died together. Entire households were wiped out. In Florence, chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio reported that the death toll was so high that they ran out of space in graveyards and had to dig mass pits where bodies were stacked in layers. The social order began to break down. With so many dying, so many fleeing, there weren't enough people left to maintain basic services. The dead couldn't be properly buried. The sick couldn't be properly cared for. In some places, The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical impact. People believed that the plague was an expression of God's wrath, a punishment for sin, and they responded by engaging in mass penance, sometimes whipping themselves bloody in the streets, in the hope that suffering would appease divine anger. Some communities looked for scapegoats and found them in Jewish populations, blaming them for the plague, despite the fact that the plague was indiscriminate and killed Jews and Christians alike. In the face of this catastrophe, the medical profession was helpless. Physicians consulted their ancient texts. They bled their patients. They prescribed herbs. They advised people to avoid bad air, to flee to the countryside if possible, to maintain proper humoral balance through diet and medicine. Nothing worked. The plague killed rich and poor, careful and careless, treated and untreated. Some patients who refused all treatment survived. Some who received the most intensive treatment died. There was no correlation between medical intervention and outcome that could be easily perceived. The physicians did what they could, but it was clear to anyone watching that they were not stopping the plague. This would have been a crisis for any profession, but for medicine it was particularly acute. Part of the physician's social role was to be the expert on disease, the trained professional who understood what others did not. When the physician's expertise proved useless in the face of plague, the entire foundation of the profession was called into question. Some physicians responded by doubling down on the classical texts, arguing that if the plague wasn't responding to the standard treatments, it was because the treatments weren't being applied correctly, or because this was a particularly virulent form of the disease that required intensified versions of the standard approaches. Others began to question whether the classical authorities had been wrong, whether there might be something about plague that their frameworks didn't capture. By the 15th century, as the initial wave of the Black Death had subsided and plague became something that recurred periodically rather than a constant apocalyptic presence, the medical profession and the authorities in various European cities began to develop more systematic approaches to dealing with the disease. Some of this came from the simple observation that certain practices seemed to help, even if the theories explaining why were wrong. Quarantine developed in Venice and other Mediterranean ports. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Goods arriving in port were kept isolated for a period of time, sometimes 40 days, sometimes varying amounts depending on the judgment of local officials, before being allowed into the city. Over time, it became clear that this practice seemed to reduce the incidence of plague following the arrival of merchant ships. Did anyone understand why? Not really. The theory was that whatever miasma or corruption was carried by the goods would dissipate over time, or that any sick people on the ships would reveal themselves during the waiting period. But the practical result was that quarantine worked. Cities that practiced it seemed to have fewer outbreaks than cities that didn't. At the same time, various cities began to employ physicians specifically to deal with plague. These were officials of the municipality, paid salaries to treat plague patients, oversee public health measures, maintain records of the sick and dead. The position was sometimes called plague doctor or physician to the plague, or sometimes given various other titles depending on the city. These were professionals, not charlatans. Many had university education, had studied medical texts, had trained under other physicians. They were responsible for diagnosing plague, for treating patients, for making recommendations about public health measures like quarantine or the removal of the sick to isolated hospitals or pest houses, as they were called. In some cities, there might be only one plague doctor for the entire city. In larger cities, there might be 3, 5, or even more. Venice, the richest and most sophisticated city in Italy, sometimes employed as many as 5 or 6 plague doctors simultaneously during outbreaks. It was in response to this professional need, the need for physicians to protect themselves while working with plague patients, that the iconic costume of the plague doctor developed. The earliest references to the distinctive mask and costume appear in Italian cities in the 16th century, with more detailed descriptions and depictions appearing in the 17th century. The costume was partly practical, partly psychological, partly symbolic. The long beaked mask, stuffed with herbs, was based on the theory of miasma. The idea was that the herbs would provide protection against corrupted air. Some masks had openings that allowed the physician to smell the herbs while working, ensuring that they were constantly inhaling the protective scents. The exact composition of the materials stuffed into the mask varied, but common ingredients included rose petals, perfumed oils, camphor, mint, lavender, and other aromatic herbs. The theory was that these strong-smelling substances would counteract the corrupted air and protect the physician from its effects. The long waxed coat served multiple purposes. In the theory of miasma, it was meant to repel the bad air, preventing the corrupted miasma from coming into direct contact with the physician's body. More practically, it protected the physician's clothes from contact with plague patients and their bodily fluids, which were extremely dangerous. The wax made the coat relatively impermeable and also made it easy to clean. Some accounts describe plague doctors carrying wands or sticks in each hand to keep their hands and arms away from their body, maintaining physical distance from anything that might be contaminated. The gloves were protective. The cane, besides being a symbol of office and authority, could be used to examine patients without having to approach too closely or touch them directly. What's important to understand is that this costume, however absurd it appears to modern eyes, represented a serious attempt to apply theory to practice in a dangerous situation. The physician putting on this costume was not pretending it would make him invulnerable. He was making a calculated decision about risk management. He knew that plague was somehow communicated through contact with sick people, even if he didn't understand the mechanism. The costume was meant to create barriers between himself and that contact. The herbs were meant to provide protection based on the theory of miasma. The physical distance created by the cane and the sticks was meant to reduce exposure. The whole ensemble was meant to be a rational application of the best available theory to the problem of treating plague patients while maintaining personal safety. And here is something crucial. To some extent, it actually worked. Not for the reasons the plague doctors thought. The herbs didn't protect against miasma, because miasma is and what causes plague, but for other reasons. The distance created by the cane and the sticks meant that the plague doctor was less likely to be bitten by infected fleas, since he was not in close contact with the patient. The attention to cleaning the waxed coat meant that he was less likely to carry contaminated materials from one house to another. The mask, while it didn't protect him from the bacteria in miasma, because miasma doesn't cause plague, did prevent him from directly inhaling respiratory droplets if he had pneumonic plague patients. Some of these elements of the costume accidentally aligned with what would later be understood as disease prevention, even though the reasoning behind them was completely wrong. In the 16th century, physicians began to write more systematically about plague and its treatment. One of the most influential figures was the Italian physician Girolamo Mercurial, who published detailed advice on how a physician should conduct himself when treating plague patients. His recommendations, published in 1577, became widely influential across Europe and shaped how plague doctors practiced for centuries afterward. Mercurial recommended that the physician not enter a plague victim's chamber in the morning, or only briefly, because the air would be most corrupted at that time. If the patient was lying in a warm room with closed windows, the air would be especially bad and should be avoided. The physician should instead try to examine patients outside or in rooms with open windows. If that wasn't possible, he should limit the time spent in the patient's presence. Mercurial also recommended that the physician not see too many plague patients in succession without a break. He should take time between patients, eat something, preferably fruit, to restore his humoral balance, drink some wine with herbs to strengthen himself. The physician should pay careful attention to the patient's pulse, color, tongue, urine, and other signs. He should avoid breathing too deeply the corrupted air, and should keep his attention on the signs and symptoms he could observe at a distance. His treatments should be based on careful assessment of the patient's constitution. A strong patient could tolerate more aggressive treatment like bloodletting, while a weak patient should receive gentler treatments. These recommendations, while based on a completely incorrect understanding of disease transmission, actually contain some practical wisdom. The advice not to spend too long in the patient's room would indeed reduce the physician's exposure. The advice not to see too many patients in succession and to take breaks would preserve the physician's health and mental stamina. The careful observation of the patient's signs and symptoms was good practice, even though the theoretical framework for understanding those signs was wrong. The observation itself was valuable. The differentiation between strong and weak patients was a form of risk stratification that made some sense. If you were going to weaken a patient with bloodletting and other aggressive treatments, you at least wanted to ensure they had the strength to survive the treatment. In practice, plague doctors in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries varied considerably in how seriously they took these recommendations and how carefully they practiced them. Some were perfunctory, seeing as many patients as they could in a day, charging what they could, and then leaving the city when the outbreak became particularly severe. Some were quite dedicated, spending considerable time with each patient, keeping careful notes, trying different approaches to see what worked better. Some became quite sophisticated in their understanding of what helped and what didn't, modifying their approach over time based on observation. The records that survive show a profession that was not monolithic, but rather contained within it a range of commitment, competence, and integrity. One of the most detailed records we have from this period comes from the practice of a plague doctor named Dr. Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia in 1793 during the yellow fever outbreak that struck the city. Yellow fever is not plague, but Rush's approach was similar to what plague doctors would have used, and his case notes give us a vivid sense of what a dedicated plague doctor's practice looked like. Rush saw dozens of patients daily. He recorded his observations carefully. He noted the patient's symptoms, his treatments, and the outcome. He prescribed bloodletting, sometimes copious amounts of it, because he believed that the disease arose from overactive circulation and that removing blood would reduce the excess. He was almost certainly wrong. Bloodletting likely weakened his patients and made them more vulnerable, but his approach was systematic and thoughtful within the framework he was operating within. Rush kept meticulous records, and they show a man trying to solve a problem, trying to figure out what was working and what wasn't, adjusting his approach based on observation. But going back to the earlier plague doctors in the European context, we can see similar patterns. In Amsterdam, in the 17th century, which became one of the great centers of plague doctor practice, and where the position was well established and well paid, there were physicians who kept detailed case notes and seemed to be genuinely trying to learn from their experience. One such physician was Cornelis Bontekoe, a Dutch physician who published a treatise on plague in the 1660s that became quite influential. Bontekoe recommended careful observation of individual patients, adaptation of treatment based on what seemed to be working, and a systematic approach to record keeping. He believed that by carefully observing many patients and noting which treatments seemed to lead to recovery and which seemed to lead to death, it might be possible to identify patterns that could guide future treatment. He was trying to do what would later be called clinical epidemiology, even without the statistical frameworks that would make such work rigorous. The reality of being a plague doctor in the 17th century, particularly during a major outbreak, was grim beyond what most modern people would be able to imagine. During the 1665 outbreak in London, the worst in the 17th century, the death toll was tremendous. The plague started in the spring, intensified through the summer, reached its peak in September, when 15,000 or more people were dying per week in a city of about 500,000, then gradually declined through the fall and winter. For months, the streets of the city were filled with the dying and the dead. Bodies were collected in carts. The famous "Bring Out Your Dead" imagery comes from this outbreak. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the corpses. The normal functions of the city broke down. Many people fled who could afford to. Those who remained either worked to maintain basic services or were themselves sick or dying. The plague doctors who remained in the city during this time were walking into a landscape of horror. They would visit homes where entire families were dead or dying. They would see the swollen nodes of bubonic plague, the buboes in the groin, and armpits, black and oozing. They would see hemorrhaging under the skin, the blackening of the extremities that gave the Black Death its name. They would see the delirium of high fever, the dehydration, the stench. They would see death in massive numbers, death that was essentially indiscriminate, that took the young and old, the rich and poor, the healthy and already ill. Many of them would contract plague themselves. Some would die. Some would survive and continue working. Some would flee to a safe place and return when the outbreak was over. The psychological impact must have been immense. These were educated men, trained in universities, accustomed to some degree of professional status and social standing. Now they were walking through streets filled with death. They were powerless to stop the disease. The treatments they prescribed almost certainly did nothing to help and might well have accelerated death by weakening the patient. They must have known, at some level, that what they were doing was likely futile, and yet they continued to work, to see patients, to prescribe treatments, to maintain the fiction that they were helping. Why? Part of the answer is surely practical. They were being paid. The plague doctors of major cities were compensated by the municipality for their work. Even if the work was dangerous and largely futile, it was employment and it was significant compensation. In London in 1665, a plague doctor might earn more than most tradespeople. In times of plague, there was high demand for medical services and high willingness to pay. So economics played a role in keeping plague doctors at their work. But there was more than economics at play. Many plague doctors seemed to take genuine satisfaction in the work, even though it was dangerous and often unsuccessful. There is evidence in their writings, in the records that survive, that they saw themselves as engaged in an important calling, that they believed they were helping, or at least trying to help in a desperate situation. They saw themselves as members of a profession with a responsibility to serve. The Hippocratic Oath, while not universally required or invoked in the way it is now still represented an ideal, the physician should treat the sick, should put the patient's welfare above his own safety, should persist in the attempt to heal even when success seemed unlikely. Some plague doctors seem to have been motivated by religious faith. They believed that God had called them to serve the sick, that their suffering in the face of plague was a form of service, that God might protect them, or that even if he didn't, their willingness to risk death for others was a form of Christian virtue. Religious motivation was probably stronger in Catholic regions than Protestant regions, and was certainly a significant factor in some physicians' willingness to continue working during plague outbreaks. And some, probably, were simply committed to the work itself, to the intellectual challenge of trying to understand and treat a disease, to the professional identity of being a physician. For such people, the fact that plague seemed to defy their understanding and resist their treatments was itself a reason to continue trying, not to abandon the effort. If they could just understand plague better, if they could find the right treatment, if they could modify their approach in just the right way, then perhaps they could make a difference. This is a profound human impulse, the belief that continued effort might succeed where previous attempts have failed. What we know for certain is that many plague doctors did die. Records from various cities document plague doctors who contracted the disease and died in their work. In Venice, in the 18th century, Careful records were kept of the physicians employed by the city. Multiple plague doctors appear in the death records from plague, sometimes documented specifically as having contracted the disease in their professional capacity. In London, Paris, Amsterdam, and other major cities, there are records of plague doctors who died. Some cities had to employ multiple plague doctors in succession, the first dying of plague and being replaced by another, who would also sometimes die, requiring still another replacement. The famous case of Charles de Lorme in France illustrates the dangers of the profession, though Lorme himself actually survived for many years. Lorme was a French physician who was perhaps the most elaborate and famous plague doctor of the 17th century. He developed an extremely comprehensive costume that included not just the mask and coat, but also special boots and leggings. He was very wealthy and could afford to travel during plague outbreaks, so he managed to avoid actually contracting plague himself, despite multiple exposures. But many of his colleagues and successors were not so fortunate. The willingness of plague doctors to continue working despite the danger is sometimes treated by modern commentators as evidence of their stupidity or delusion. They must not have understood how dangerous the work was, or they must have believed their protective costume actually worked. But this dismissal seems unfair. Many plague doctors probably did understand the danger. They may have hoped that their protective measures would help, but they must have known that other plague doctors before them had died despite wearing the same costume. They probably understood, at some level, that they were choosing to engage in work that had a significant probability of killing them. And they did it anyway. The experience of repeated plague outbreaks over centuries would have shaped how plague doctors understood their work. In 1347 to 1351, the first great outbreak of the Black Death killed approximately 75 to 200 million people worldwide, with European mortality reaching perhaps 30 to 60%. But the plague didn't end with that initial outbreak. It recurred, sometimes at intervals of several years, sometimes after decades, but recurred repeatedly. In the 17th century, there were major outbreaks in London, 1625, 1636, 1665 to 1666, in Paris, and other French cities, in the Mediterranean ports. In the 18th century, outbreaks continued, though they seemed to be becoming less frequent and less catastrophic. In the early 19th century, there was still plague in various parts of Europe, though the major pandemics had ended. A plague doctor practicing in the 17th century would have had experience probably of multiple outbreaks. He would have seen people recover and people die. He would have observed patterns, even if his understanding of the underlying mechanisms was completely wrong. He would have understood that plague was the most dangerous occupational hazard in his profession. He would have known physicians who had died of plague. And yet, if he was good at what he did, he would probably have developed some sense of confidence, not that he could cure plague, but that he could help patients, that he could ease suffering, that he could at least do better than sitting at home and doing nothing. It's important to emphasize just how sophisticated some plague doctors became in their approach. While some were perfunctory or opportunistic, others developed genuinely sophisticated systems for observing, recording, and analyzing their cases. The 18th century Italian physician Giovanni Antonio Galli, who practiced in Rome, kept detailed notes on his plague cases, recording for each patient the date of onset, the initial symptoms, how the disease progressed, what treatments were administered, and whether the patient recovered or died. When he examined his data, he noticed patterns. Certain treatments seemed more likely to be associated with recovery in certain types of patients. Some patients who developed certain symptoms early seemed more likely to survive. The progression of the disease seemed to follow certain typical patterns. Galli was doing what we would now call clinical medicine: careful observation, documentation, analysis of outcomes without the statistical frameworks and controlled trials that would later become essential to medical research. He couldn't prove anything in a rigorous sense, but he was accumulating knowledge through systematic observation. And this knowledge, while it wouldn't help against plague specifically, was valuable for other purposes. The habit of careful observation, detailed documentation, and analysis of outcomes would become one of the foundations of modern medical practice. Some plague doctors became particularly interested in the question of contagion, whether plague was communicable directly from person to person, or whether it arose from miasma in the environment. The dominant theory, as discussed earlier, was miasma theory, but there were dissenters. The Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro, mentioned earlier, had proposed a contagion theory in the 16th century, and while his work was largely ignored by his contemporaries, it never entirely disappeared. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a few physicians began to notice phenomena that were hard to explain with miasma theory. They noticed that plague seemed to travel along trade routes more readily than it would if it were simply spread by bad air. They noticed that cities that practiced quarantine and isolation seemed to have fewer cases, and that this effect was greater than could be explained by the simple removal of bad air. A few physicians began to hypothesize that there might be something, some kind of imperceptible agent, that was being transmitted from sick to healthy people, and that this transmission could be prevented or interrupted by isolation. The Austrian physician, Athanasius Kircher, working in the 17th century, actually observed through a primitive microscope what he believed were tiny living organisms in the blood of plague patients, which he called corpuscles. He hypothesized that these might be the agents of plague transmission, though he was not able to develop this insight into a complete theory. His observations were largely dismissed by his contemporaries and forgotten by his successors. The microscopes of that era were too crude, and the background of theory was too committed to miasma for such observations to gain traction. But the fact that a few physicians were beginning to think about contagion, to question the universal applicability of miasma theory, shows that within the framework of plague doctor practice, there was intellectual development occurring. The profession was not static. Practitioners were observing, questioning, modifying their understanding based on what they saw. They were wrong about most of what they believed, but they were engaged in a genuine process of trying to understand reality better. The question of why plague doctors persisted in their practices, despite such limited success, is worth exploring more deeply. By any objective measure, plague doctors were not solving the problem of plague. Mortality rates in plague-infected cities were not significantly lower with the presence of plague doctors and their treatments than they might have been without. The disease continued to kill people at tremendous rates. From the perspective of pure outcomes, the plague doctor was a failure. But let's consider what the alternative was. If there had been no plague doctors, if the medical profession had simply refused to engage with plague, what would have happened? The answer is, probably not much would have been different in terms of mortality from the disease itself. But something else would have been different. There would have been no attempt, no effort, no representation of the idea that the community cared enough to try to do something about the plague. There would have been nothing but chaos and collapse. The plague doctor, in some ways, was a symbol of the idea that the disease was not simply an act of God that had to be accepted passively. The plague doctor represented the belief that something could be done, that knowledge and effort and professional expertise could make a difference. Whether or not this belief was justified given the actual effectiveness of the treatments, the belief itself was important. It gave people hope. It gave structure to the chaos. It represented the community's commitment to care for the sick even in the face of overwhelming mortality. This is something that might seem strange to modern people, accustomed to living in a time when medicine genuinely does make a difference, when diseases are actually cured or prevented by medical interventions. But in the world of the plague doctor, the value of medicine was partly symbolic and partly about managing hope and despair. In a time of apocalyptic crisis, the arrival of a trained physician in his distinctive costume was itself a kind of treatment, even if the medical interventions he provided accomplished nothing. It was a statement that order had not completely broken down, that expertise still mattered, that someone cared enough to try. Consider what happens in a community struck by plague without any medical presence at all. There is panic. There is flight. There is the abandonment of the sick by family members and neighbors. There is the complete breakdown of social functions. Bodies pile up unburied. The living die from starvation and suicide because all social connection has dissolved. The presence of the plague doctor changed this dynamic. The physician, in his costume, could say to people, "I am trained. I understand what is happening. I have treatments that may help. Follow these protocols, and we can manage this." None of this was actually true. He didn't understand. The treatments didn't help, but the statement itself had value. It prevented complete social collapse. It gave people something to do, a protocol to follow, a reason to remain engaged with their community, rather than simply fleeing. The records from cities that had plague doctors versus those that didn't show no significant difference in mortality rates from the disease itself. But they do show that cities with organized plague doctor systems tended to recover more quickly after an outbreak, to suffer less severe disruption of social functions, and to experience less complete breakdown of community structure. The plague doctor was not effective as a medical intervention, but he was valuable as a social intervention. He was performing a function that was real and important, even though it wasn't medical in the modern sense. This is not to say that all plague doctors were motivated purely by these social considerations, or that they all understood their role in this way. Many genuinely believed that their treatments were helping, based on the fact that some patients recovered and the theory seemed sound within its framework. Some were primarily motivated by the financial compensation. Some were conscientious practitioners trying to apply the best available knowledge to a terrible problem. Some were opportunists taking advantage of fear and desperation to charge high fees, and then leaving when the outbreak got bad. The profession contained all of these types, and probably it always does. But taking the profession as a whole, over the centuries and across the cities where it was practiced, the plague doctors were performing functions that turned out to be genuinely valuable. Even though they were not functions they understood themselves to be performing. They were maintaining social structure. They were preventing complete collapse of community function. They were developing and refining practices of isolation and quarantine that actually worked to limit disease transmission, even though the theory behind them was wrong. They were accumulating observations and records that, while filtered through an incorrect theoretical framework, contained valuable information about the disease and about how to manage patients during epidemics. The development of quarantine procedures is a particularly good example of how plague doctor practice, based on wrong theories, led to practices that actually worked. As mentioned earlier, the quarantine of goods coming into port developed in Mediterranean trading cities like Venice because of the observation that goods seemed to carry plague. The miasma theory couldn't explain this well. How could goods carry bad air? But it was observed to happen. If goods from the east were more likely to bring plague, then perhaps isolating them for a period of time would allow any corrupted air or invisible contagion to dissipate. Therefore, the practice of quarantine developed. Goods would be kept separate for a specified period, often 40 days, before being allowed into the city. What was actually happening was something quite different from what was being theorized. Plague is carried by fleas and rats. Goods in the ships could carry infected rats or fleas. Given time, the rats might die from plague, or the fleas might find no new host and die, or the fleas carrying the plague bacterium might bite and infect rats that were not then available to transmit to humans. By the time 40 days had passed, the plague bacteria and fleas might be dead, and goods could be safely handled. The quarantine worked, but not for the reason physicians thought. Nevertheless, the practice persisted and was refined based on observation of whether it seemed to work. By the 18th century, quarantine was a well-established practice in Mediterranean cities. When outbreaks occurred, goods were quarantined, suspected persons were isolated, and these measures did seem to reduce the spread of plague compared to cities without such measures. Physicians and public health officials could point to the success of quarantine as evidence that their approach was working, which reinforced their belief in miasma theory and their faith that the protocols they were developing were based on sound reasoning. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as the frequency of plague outbreaks decreased, as the disease became less apocalyptic and more manageable, there was a shift in how plague doctors were understood and employed. In the early centuries of plague, the plague doctor had been an emergency response, an apocalyptic crisis. By the 18th century, in some cities, the position had become more institutionalized. There were permanent plague hospitals, called lazarets or pest houses, with permanent staff. There were formal procedures for diagnosis, quarantine, and treatment. The position of plague doctor, rather than being a temporary emergency role, became a permanent position in the civic infrastructure, a recognized part of how the city managed health and disease. In Venice, this institutionalization reached perhaps its highest level of development in the 18th century. The Venetian government employed multiple physicians specifically for plague management. There was a hierarchy, the chief physician who was responsible for overseeing the entire system, the physicians to the lazaret who managed the hospital, the physicians to the port who examined incoming goods and passengers, the physicians who conducted home visits among the population. There were nurses and attendants. There was a structure and a system. When a suspected case of plague occurred, there were procedures. Notification to the chief physician, examination by qualified physicians, quarantine of the patient and their family, isolation of their goods, potential quarantine of nearby inhabitants, depending on the judgment of the physicians. This system did work to some extent to limit plague outbreaks. Venice experienced a significant outbreak in 1576, then recurring outbreaks in the 17th century, and then in the 18th century experienced some years with cases of plague, but no major outbreaks. Whether this success was due to the quarantine procedures, or the plague simply becoming less severe over time, or some other factor, is hard to say. But contemporary Venetians believed that their systematic approach was making a difference, and there was probably some truth to this. Systematic isolation and quarantine, even if motivated by wrong theory, does limit disease transmission. One of the most remarkable plague doctors of the 18th century was Bernardino Ramazzini, an Italian physician who practiced in Padua and Modena. Ramazzini was famous not just for his work on plague, but for his pioneering work on occupational health. He understood that people who worked in certain professions were at higher risk for certain diseases, and he wrote a comprehensive work on occupational medicine that became influential. But he also worked on plague, and in his writings about plague, we can see a physician trying to reconcile his careful observations with the theoretical framework available to him. Ramazzini noticed that certain occupations seemed to have higher rates of plague: people who worked in port cities, people involved in trade, people who handled goods that came from plague-affected regions. He theorized that this was because such people were more exposed to corrupted air, which made sense within his theoretical framework. But his careful observation that occupation and location correlated with plague risk was valuable information, even though his explanation for why was wrong. Ramazzini was also particularly concerned with the health of physicians themselves. He noted that many physicians died in their practice of medicine, particularly during plague. He recommended various measures to preserve physician health: careful diet, exercise, attention to mental state. He even recommended that physicians should not work too hard, should rest periodically, should avoid becoming too emotionally attached to their patients, because the psychological strain was damaging to health. Some of his recommendations seem remarkably modern. The need to protect medical professionals' mental health, to prevent burnout, to ensure that physicians themselves receive care. It seems Ramazzini understood that the practice of medicine was emotionally and physically demanding, and that physicians paid a price for their work. As the 18th century progressed into the 19th century, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment were producing profound changes in how educated people thought about the world. The old theoretical frameworks were coming under increasing scrutiny. The discoveries of the scientific method were beginning to reshape how knowledge was understood and developed. In medicine, new anatomical knowledge was being developed. William Harvey's demonstration of the circulation of blood, published in 1628, was gradually becoming accepted and reshaping medical thinking, though it took longer than we might expect. The theory of humors was being challenged, not abandoned, but increasingly questioned. And yet the plague persisted. There were outbreaks in the early 19th century, in southern France in 1815, in Russia in the 1820s-1830s, in various Mediterranean locations. The disease had not gone away, even though it was less frequent and less catastrophic than in the medieval and early modern periods. The profession of plague doctor persisted as well, even though it was increasingly anachronistic in the context of emerging new medical understanding. In the early 19th century, there was an interesting period where plague doctors and new-style physicians who believed in different theories coexisted in the same cities, sometimes cooperating, sometimes in conflict. This was particularly true in port cities in the Mediterranean and in Russia. A new generation of physicians, trained in the emerging medical schools and influenced by ideas of positivism and empiricism, would sometimes challenge the traditional approaches of plague doctors. These young physicians would argue for new methods based on new understanding of disease. The plague doctors, meanwhile, clung to their traditional theories and practices, sometimes with good reason. The new theories were not uniformly better than the old, and in some cases, the new physicians were advocating approaches that were actually worse than the traditional ones. A case study of this conflict can be found in Paris in the 1830s, when cholera arrived in Europe, and there was intense debate among physicians about how to treat it. Some physicians believed in the miasma theory of cholera and advocated various measures based on that theory. Others began to advocate for different approaches based on newer ideas about disease. Still others, including some traditional plague doctors who had reoriented their practice toward cholera, advocated for isolation and quarantine based on their experience with plague. The debate was intense and often bitter. But what's important to note is that some of the traditional approaches, based on the wrong theory, ended up being more effective than some of the new approaches based on the newer theory. This is because the mechanisms of disease are complex, and a wrong theory can sometimes lead to right practices through coincidence or through multiple levels of causation. By the middle of the 19th century, the position of plague doctor was becoming extinct in Europe. In most cities, it had already disappeared, replaced by public health officials with different training and different theories. The few plague doctors who remained were often older men who had trained in the old ways and had not adapted to the new medical paradigm. In Russia, where the profession persisted somewhat longer, there was still talk of plague doctors in some cities in the 1860s and 1870s, but by the end of the century, even there, the profession had disappeared. And then came a remarkable discovery that would retroactively explain why the plague doctors had persisted so stubbornly despite such limited practical success. They had actually, through their best practices and protocols, been doing the right things for mostly the wrong reasons. In the 1890s, the French-Swiss physician Alexander Yersin, working with modern microscopy and the emerging germ theory of disease, identified the bacterium that causes plague. It was named Yersinia pestis after him. Around the same time, the Japanese bacteriologist Shibasaburo Kitasato made similar discoveries. The plague was caused by a bacterium that was transmitted primarily through the bites of infected fleas from infected rats. This explained why quarantine worked. It prevented the transmission of infected goods carrying infected rats or fleas. It explained why isolation worked. It prevented the flea vectors from accessing new hosts. It explained why the disease had seemed to travel along trade routes, because trade goods carried the rats and fleas that transmitted the disease. But it also meant that most of what plague doctors had believed about the disease was wrong. The four humors didn't exist as described. Miasma didn't cause plague. Bloodletting didn't help. The herbs and potions prescribed as treatments were useless. The protective measures, the waxed coat, the mask, the gloves, worked not because they protected against miasma, but because they prevented flea bites and reduced contact with infected materials. Some of the accidentally correct practices, like isolation and quarantine, worked not because they allowed corrupted air to dissipate, but because they interrupted the transmission cycle between rats, fleas, and humans. The irony is that if a plague doctor from the 16th century had been told that plague was caused by tiny, worm-like creatures that lived in fleas, which lived on rats, and that the best way to prevent plague was to isolate the sick and isolate goods from known plague-affected areas, he would have said, "Yes, exactly. That is what we have been saying. The tiny creatures are part of the miasma. The miasma is the carrier. Isolation prevents the miasma from spreading." The framework was completely wrong, but some of the practical conclusions were accidentally right. When the bacterium was identified and the transmission mechanism was understood, the knowledge of how to prevent plague suddenly became clear. Rat control, flea control, isolation of cases, these practices, if consistently applied, could essentially eliminate plague in human populations. The development of antibiotics in the 20th century made plague, when it did occur, treatable. The combination of prevention and treatment has made plague essentially a disease of the past in developed countries, though it persists in parts of Africa and Asia where conditions favor its transmission. The legacy of the plague doctors is thus complicated. On the one hand, they were completely wrong about the theory of plague. Their treatments were useless or harmful. Their protective measures, while accidentally partly effective, were based on false premises. They persisted in their beliefs despite the failure of their practices, maintaining theories that were increasingly at odds with emerging scientific knowledge. In this sense, they represent the failure of authority, the persistence of outdated beliefs, the danger of clinging to false theories even when evidence against them accumulates. On the other hand, the plague doctors represented a commitment to trying, to doing something in the face of an overwhelming crisis. They developed practices that, while based on wrong theory, happened to work well enough to limit disease transmission. They created institutional structures for managing epidemics that became the foundation for modern public health. They demonstrated, through centuries of practice, that systematic observation and recording of cases, careful examination of patients, and modification of approach based on outcomes could lead to better results than ad hoc responses. They showed that even without understanding the underlying mechanism of a disease, it was possible through careful attention to what worked and what didn't to develop effective strategies for dealing with it. The plague doctors also made a contribution that is less tangible, but perhaps equally important. They maintained the idea that diseases could be studied, understood, and managed. They maintained the medical profession through centuries of plague, preventing it from completely disappearing or from becoming purely a collection of folk remedies and superstition. When the scientific revolution came, when germ theory was developed, when the actual causes of disease began to be understood, there was already in place a medical profession with centuries of experience in careful observation and practice. The transition from plague doctor medicine to modern medicine was not a complete break, but rather an evolution, a refining of practices and a correcting of theories while maintaining the commitment to systematic observation and careful practice. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as plague became less frequent, but didn't disappear, the plague doctors had to face an interesting question. If the treatments didn't work, if mortality from plague was not significantly different, whether treated or untreated, what was the value of their profession? Some responded by becoming more sophisticated in their observation and analysis, by collecting more data, by trying to understand what factors correlated with recovery and what factors made outcomes worse. Some responded by writing philosophical and theoretical works, trying to reconcile their theory with the observed facts. Some responded by simply continuing to practice as before, assuming that their treatments must be helping because they were following proper medical theory. A few responded with genuine intellectual innovation. In the 18th century, there were physicians who began to notice that plague seemed to spread in patterns that didn't quite fit miasma theory. One such physician was Pierre Louis, a French physician who pioneered the use of statistics in medicine. He carefully collected data on patients treated for various diseases, including plague in some cases, and analyzed the outcomes. He began to question whether treatments that were universally prescribed were actually helping patients. He introduced the idea of comparing outcomes between treated and untreated patients to see if there was actually a benefit from the treatment. This approach was revolutionary, and it led him to question many standard medical practices. It is a remarkable fact that this kind of thinking, the idea of carefully comparing outcomes between treatment groups, was not standard in medicine until well into the 19th century. For centuries, physicians could prescribe treatments based on theory, and as long as some patients recovered, they could claim success. The idea of asking whether those patients would have recovered anyway, whether the recovery rate was different from what you would get without treatment, was not part of standard medical thinking. Pierre Louis and a few other physicians in the 18th and 19th centuries began to introduce this kind of statistical thinking into medicine, and it would eventually transform the profession. For plague doctors specifically, such thinking would have been devastating, because it would have meant facing directly the fact that their treatments accomplished nothing. Some plague doctors, reading or hearing about such work, probably felt threatened. Others probably found it liberating, an excuse to rethink their practice based on observation rather than on received theory. But by the time such thinking became widespread, the plague was receding anyway, and the profession of plague doctor was becoming obsolete. By 1900, there was probably not a single person in Europe still practicing primarily as a plague doctor. The profession had completely disappeared. In Russia, where it had persisted somewhat longer, even there, it was gone by the end of the 19th century. What remained were public health officials, epidemiologists, and ordinary physicians who sometimes had to deal with cases of plague in certain regions. But the specific profession of the plague doctor, with its distinctive costume and its specialized knowledge, had vanished from history. Yet the plague itself had not vanished. Cases continued to occur. In the 20th century, plague would be identified in various parts of the world. In the American West, plague persists to this day in wild rodent populations, and occasional human cases still occur. The disease is much less frequent and much less deadly than in historical times, but it is not extinct. If someone contracted plague today, the treatments available, antibiotics, supportive care, modern medical technology, would give them a much better chance of survival than any patient in the era of the plague doctor had. But if you compare the treatments, the antibiotics that kill the bacteria, the modern supportive care that maintains the patient as vital functions, to the bloodletting and herbal remedies of the plague doctor, you can see how far medicine has come in understanding disease and developing effective treatments. What is remarkable is that the transition from plague doctor medicine to modern medicine did not happen as quickly as we might expect, given the emergence of germ theory. The bacterium causing plague was identified in the 1890s, but plague doctors had already largely disappeared by then. The reason is that the profession had already become obsolete for other reasons. As plague became less frequent, there was less need for specialists in plague. As medical education modernized and new theories emerged, students were trained in these new approaches rather than in the traditional plague doctor methods. As public health took on a larger role in disease management, the medical profession's role shifted. The plague doctor was the victim of obsolescence, not of dramatic refutation. But in retrospect, what's striking is how much sense the plague doctors were making, given their framework. If you truly believed that disease arose from imbalanced humors and corrupted air, then bloodletting and the inhalation of herbs and isolation from bad air made sense. If you believed that the physician's role was to try to restore humoral balance and protect the patient from miasma, then the protocols made sense. The framework was wrong, but the logic was internally consistent. What this tells us is something important about the history of science and medicine, that intelligent people working within a false framework can appear to be foolish or superstitious, but in fact, they are engaging in reasonable thinking given the available evidence. The plague doctors were not stupid. They were educated physicians applying theory consistently to practice. The problem was that the theory was wrong, and they had no way of knowing it was wrong because the tools to test it didn't exist yet. This is a humbling lesson for us in the modern era. We believe that we understand disease better than the plague doctors did, and of course we do. Our understanding is based on actual knowledge of bacteria and viruses and how they spread. But there are probably aspects of disease that we are equally wrong about. Aspects of medical practice that are based on frameworks that are incomplete or incorrect. Perhaps in 200 years, people will look back at 21st century medicine with the same mixture of admiration and bewilderment that we feel looking at plague doctors. They will see that we had some things right, but missed other things completely. They will see treatments that we thought were helping, but that actually weren't. Theories that we believed, but that were wrong. Practices that happened to work, but for the wrong reasons. The path of the plague doctor is thus not just a historical curiosity, but a sort of mirror in which to see our own medical practice and our own limitations. It reminds us that knowledge is provisional, that frameworks are limited, that the most educated and well-intentioned practitioners can be wrong about fundamental aspects of what they are doing. It reminds us of the importance of continuing to observe, to question, to test assumptions, to be willing to abandon theories when evidence accumulates against them. Most of all, it reminds us that the willingness to try to engage with the problem even when you don't fully understand it to do something rather than nothing is not itself foolish or superstitious, but rather a fundamental part of human engagement with the world's problems. The plague doctors walked a long road through history. They walked through cities filled with death and tried to help. They wore strange costumes that probably looked absurd even to their contemporaries. They prescribed treatments that accomplished nothing. They kept detailed records and tried to learn from their observations. They died, many of them, in the course of their work. They were replaced by others who followed the same practices, often with similar outcomes. Over centuries, this slow accumulation of practice, observation, and refinement contributed to the development of medical science, public health, and the understanding of disease. When the plague doctor finally disappeared from history, he left behind a legacy that was much more than just a cautionary tale about how wrong people can be. He left behind an approach to medicine characterized by careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and willingness to modify practice based on outcome. He left behind institutional structures for managing epidemics and protecting public health. He left behind the principle that medical professionals had a responsibility to serve patients even at risk to themselves. He left behind practices like quarantine and isolation that, though developed for the wrong reasons, turned out to be effective ways to control infectious disease. In the modern era of medicine, when we quarantine infectious patients, we are following practices developed by plague doctors in the 16th and 17th centuries. When we keep careful medical records on each patient, documenting symptoms and treatments and outcomes, we are practicing a form of clinical observation that plague doctors pioneered. When we understand disease as something that spreads from person to person, and that can be slowed or stopped by isolation and careful attention to hygiene, we are building on foundations laid by centuries of plague doctor practice. The fact that the specific theories underlying those practices were wrong does not diminish the value of the practices themselves or of the commitment to systematic observation that produced them. The story of the plague doctor is thus the story of how human beings respond to catastrophe. It is the story of the gap between knowledge and belief, between theory and practice. It is the story of educated people doing their best with inadequate tools. It is the story of failure transformed into learning, of wrong theories that happen to lead to some right practices. It is the story of people who kept trying even when trying seemed futile, and who maintained institutions and practices that would eventually, through generations of refinement and the emergence of new knowledge, contribute to the control and eventual near elimination of one of history's greatest killers. The roads that plague doctors walk through medieval and Renaissance cities are no longer walked by anyone in the same costume with the same theories. But they are still walked by modern physicians and public health officials doing the same essential work with better tools and better understanding. The plague doctor is gone, but the approach he represented, systematic engagement with disease, careful observation, institutional response to epidemic, commitment to care for the sick, is still very much alive. That is the true legacy of the Reaper's Road.